Yeah, so I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist by training and background. I studied forensic psychology originally, working with criminal populations in South London. Then went on to study clinical psychology, working in the NHS, in adults and children's services. And then after I left the NHS, studying psychotherapy. Why? Felt like a sensible thing to do at the time. I spend most of my days now delivering training. So this idea of taking a bunch of academic and clinical ideas, turning them into practical and usable things. So I deliver lots of different workshops around leadership, well-being and culture in lots of different high-pressure environments such as the NHS, military and big business. My interest has always been this idea that knowledge is for sharing, not for hoarding. So how can I create things and deliver ideas that people can use day to day? So this is an idea that I quite like around, a change in awareness is far less likely to lead to a change in behaviour, and a change in behaviour will lead to a change in awareness. So this idea that awareness is great, and we spend a lot of time doing lots of awareness courses, but behaviour change is better. This idea of doing. So my courses focus a lot on that. Big ideas, concepts reduced down to core ideas within them, and then turning it into practical things we can do day to day to embed that knowledge. My overarching interest is in this idea of cultivating culture. How do we build well-being orientated cultures? It's a concept I love so much that I wrote a book about it last year, which is essentially the same thing, practical tools and strategies to construct environments in the workplace that support and encourage our well-being. So my training focuses a lot around that. What I like about partnering with Myad is not only their investment in sort of quality, evidence-based strategies, right, rather than these sort of off-the-shelf or maybe like off Google strategies that I see about. So it's investment in quality, but providing people with skills and tools that they need, right? So there's an idea in therapy where you meet people where they are rather than where you want them to be. So this idea of asking people what they need, providing tools to meet that need, right? So I like this as well. We provide actual useful skills day to day. And perhaps the idea that the work that we do with Myad, the skills that apply for work, obviously are these cultures at work and our environments of work, but they're things that can apply in life. And my courses very much adhere to that. These are useful skills for interpersonal relationships at work, but also day to day. I think my honest answer would be the common challenge most people face when they come onto our training courses is probably time, right? This sense of a lack of time. So this feeling that it's all well and good to give me these lovely ideas, but how am I supposed to use them? So what is different, I think, about Myad courses is finding strategies that fit within our existing environment, right? It would be lovely if we could reshape the entire system, but what we can do is the stuff in our day-to-day interactions. So a question I'll often ask people, so much around our well-being and around time and things like that, is about our perception of what we can control. Right? So a question I'll ask people sometimes is, tell me all the things you can control in your life. Right? Somebody might throw out, oh, I can control what I eat, Hugo. And I say, great. What happens if Tesco's runs out of avocados? Can you control what you eat then? Okay, well, maybe not. Okay, I can control what I wear. Okay, what about if your favorite jacket's in the wash? Something like that, okay? And we end up down usually with, I can control how I respond or react to things, right? This tiny piece of choices that was within it. So I suppose what is different about my course is that we find things you can do something about, right? Pieces you can take control over that will fit into the existing environments you're in and hopefully then elicit broader change. So I think what is a challenge on some training courses is that we're given a lovely toolbox of tools, but not the time or the understanding of how that might fit in the day-to-day. So I think this is what we do a bit differently. I think why it's so important right now, I mean, if you think about the NHS right now, if you look at trainees, for example, and how many trainees are not completing training, and then the reasons they give for not completing their training, almost, the majority, it's well-being and stress-related. And again, also for our doctors who've been there a while, like the level of stress in the NHS is incredibly high. And it's this idea about when I see trainees that have left or doctors that have left due to stress, there's there's a part of me that thinks, I wonder if things could have been different, if somebody could have noticed, we could have had a slightly different conversation, rather than being reactive, being slightly more proactive. So why I think it's important is to embed some skills to notice when things start to change and shift, right? And then to be able to have a conversation. Often we'll deliver training courses and people will ask me, like, what are the signs and symptoms of stress? You go, what does it look like? And we'll go through some classic signs and symptoms that somebody might be in distress. And then I'll remind them that it might look like these things and it might look like none of these things. Because what you're looking for is a change off the baseline, right? But you'll never notice a change off the baseline if you don't know what the baseline was to start with. Right? So it's this idea of knowing your colleagues, so we notice a change. And any of those changes doesn't mean anything in and of itself, but it's an invitation for curiosity. It's an opportunity for a conversation. So I think often what can be challenging is that people will have one piece but not the other. So we might notice but not quite sure how to start that conversation. We might be great communicators but not be very good at spotting the signs or noticing that invitation. So bringing some of those skills together so we can be more of a supportive system for one another, okay, to notice when we're struggling and to offer that support and signposting as soon as possible. Yeah, so it's a 90-minute session, usually delivered online. We do some in-person sessions as well. We'll focus on, again, I suppose, this idea of how we might notice the change off the baseline and how we might start those conversations. This idea of maybe what to say, maybe what not to say, how to create safety in that communication, and I'll touch a little bit on how we might get people where they need to go. It isn't your job necessarily to fix people. Our job is to notice, to listen, to get them where they need to go to get support. So people will leave with some practical tools and strategies to do that at work, and as I said before, to do that in life, to notice when friends, family members are struggling as well. So this is one of my favorite topics to deliver, think before you speak. And I touch a little bit maybe on this idea of brainwise communication, that your sort of hardwired stress response gets in the way of effective communication sometimes. Why is it important right now? Again, we talk about these high pressure, high stress environments. And if we think about how that stress response affects how we communicate, we will notice that a lot of the time we will have miscommunications, right? And miscommunications, I think, a bit of a dirty word sometimes, but miscommunication is two people trying to communicate, but they miss, right? It's not inherently bad. We're attempting to do this joining. We've missed in some way. So think before you speak focuses on your ability to notice this impact of stress on your communication and bring yourself back into a place where you can communicate effectively. Because again, one of the biggest sources of stress in the workplace is miscommunication, is how we communicate with our colleagues and how we are communicated with. So if we can do a little more to notice and be conscious in our communication, we can do a little more about that to build a sense of connection and community, rather than often what we get sometimes, misunderstanding, fear, disconnection. So the power of choice, 90 minutes, delivered online or in person. The premise, the idea, I suppose, is around the relationship between burnout and perceived choice and control. So the benefits, hopefully, that we end with is to be able to do a little bit more to prevent or protect against burnout, and some everyday practices to bring us back to this position of understanding the impact of choice. So the source of a lot of stress in life as well as work is perceived control and choice. Right? I notice this a lot in my therapeutic work, but also my work with organizations. In fact, there's a fascinating study called the nursing home plant study. Very simple premise. It takes place in a nursing home, classically a place where there's not a lot of choice and control. And the experimenters gave half of the participants a pot plant. So can you look after this pot plant, please? What they noticed over time was the people that had the pot plant had an increase and uptick in well-being, even though the control they had was unrelated to the control that they were after. Right? A tiny piece of control had an impact on well-being. If we expand that out, think about the workplace. we can notice how a lot of burnout, a lot of stress is related to that lack of control. So if we can bring our awareness back, have a shift in mindset more towards this control and choice element, we can do a lot to protect against stress and burnout. So the purpose of the course, I suppose, is to help us with that mindset shift, right? Where can we notice and identify pieces of control to have a positive impact on well-being for ourselves, but also for our teams, right? It is a very simple, very cost-effective intervention to have a significant impact on well-being. I tell you one thing I noticed training as when I was studying clinical psychology, when I trained as a psychotherapist, is noticing that the skills that you are taught are exactly that. They're skills. There's nothing necessarily magic about therapists and things like that. They're just given a set of skills and tools that they apply and get better at. And I always got to thinking, well, why can't we share these tools with other people? They're useful day-to-day activities. And this idea that you don't need to be a therapist to have a therapeutic conversation. So this course focuses on that. What tools can I take from this space of therapy? Effective communication strategies for listening, for empathy, for not trying to rescue and fix all the time, and apply to day, our work interactions. It does exactly that. So we'll share some tools around communication, around listening, around creating safe spaces. There's a term that's just come to me that people often talk about, holding space. Right? Talk about holding space. Which is a lovely idea. And whenever I think about holding space, I think about, imagine if you gave somebody a tatty plastic bag, right? Here you go, here's a tatty plastic bag. What are they going to put in that tatty plastic bag? Right? The recycling, some rubbish, a wet t-shirt, something like that. What about if you gave them a beautiful wooden box, all filigree with lovely silver and gems and a lovely little lock? What would they put in that? They put things that matter, things that have value. So this idea about how do we hold beautiful, meaningful spaces for people so they can share things that matter. So at the end of the course, people will leave with tools around communication, around listening, around creating safety, and around asking good questions, okay, to seek to understand before we seek to be understood. 90 minutes, online or in person. We'll explore some sort of key therapeutic communication tools focused around listening, asking good questions, and this idea of creating safety or holding space. People will leave with tools to be able to do this in their everyday interactions with colleagues at work, particularly in stressful or emotive situations where these tools can be useful. And they'll leave with the understanding that a lot of the time, if somebody comes to talk to you and they're struggling, they're not seeking a solution. They're not seeking it to be fixed. They're wanting to feel heard, to feel listened to. And that listening really is a skill. And it's a skill you can develop. And a skill that we can develop in 90 minutes on a course. And just like many of the other courses, it will give you skills for work, obviously, but skills for life, for all of your interpersonal relationships. Yeah, I think it's been an important topic for a while. I think it became increasingly talked about during the pandemic. Talked about it a lot more. People kept reaching out for courses around resilience and things like that. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the term means. So many years ago, I was working with the British military around this concept, resilience. They'd approached me to do a piece of research around the construct and trainability of resilience. What is it and how do we teach it? So after sifting through about 100 years of research, I came to some core pieces that make it up, the pieces that you can learn, that you can develop. And I think often the idea around resilience is that it's about sort of toughing it out, stronger, better, harder, faster. But in reality, resilience is about adaptability, how we adapt and flex and change, in response to changes in our environment, stress and things like that. How we flex and adapt is the key piece. So why is it important now? Because unfortunately, the only constant in life is change. So the better you are at adapting to it, the more you'll be able to tolerate and manage as things change. So 90 minutes delivered online or in person. We'll focus on understanding what resilience is and what it isn't. Touch on this idea of adaptability and how we go about that. And I tend to break it down to this idea of the resilience mindset, how we can have this shift in mindset to develop these core pieces that help us build our resilience, right? So people will leave not only with an understanding of resilience, but also some practical strategies to start building up their own resilience for themselves, but also for their teams, the people that they work with. And hopefully an understanding that it doesn't have to be complicated and doesn't mean always toughing everything out. That these are actual day-to-day behaviours that we can engage in that will build up our ability to tolerate change. Yeah, quick lesson in evolutionary neuroscience, if you like, which is what everybody was wanting, a bit of evolutionary neuroscience. To understand your sort of hardwired stress response in your brain. So I borrowed this little model from Dan Siegel, I think. But let's imagine that this hand is your brain. Okay, wrist in the palm, brainstem, oldest bit of the brain, first bit to develop, does boring stuff like breathing, heartbeat, circulation. Okay, wrap your thumb over there. That's your limbic system. Wraps around that bit of your brain. You can think of it like emotional responses to your environment. Your thumbnail, that's your amygdala, your brain's threat detector, danger sensor, smoke alarm. Okay, fold your fingers over the top. That's neocortex. That's all the funky, groovy, foldy bits of your brain. Do the nice, logical, rational computer thinking you probably think you do all the time. When you get hit with a stressor or a stressful situation, you flip your lid, and that bit becomes disconnected from that bit. You're just running on fight or flight and emotional responses, and you're unable to access lovely, logical, rational thinking. To give you an example of that, the best example of that ever actually in recent years, do you remember at the start of lockdown when everyone was bulk buying toilet paper? Yeah? Perfect example of this. Logical, rational brain, disengaged, just running on fight or flight and fear. Okay, you can't eat toilet paper or spend it. It wasn't the cure for COVID, and yet there we were. The reason for this hardwired response, right, when we get hit with any sort of stressor, is your amygdala. Okay, and I often describe the amygdala as like a smoke alarm or a smoke detector. So I imagine that everybody's got a smoke alarm or a smoke detector in their house. If you don't, you should probably get one. If I was to ask you what it's for, why it was invented, I imagine you'll say, "Tell me if there's a fire, Hugo." I'll say, "Great. When does your smoke alarm usually go off? When you burn a toast? When you have an over-enthusiastic shower? When you do the hoovering? Does it make a different sound for catastrophic house fire and burnt toast?" No. Same applies to your amygdala. Any detected threat, emotional, social, physical, boom, goes off. So if we think about this in the context of communication, any stressor is going to shut down your ability to do lovely, logical, rational thinking and communicate from that position. So what we need to get good at is to notice when this has happened and find a way to come back down to here, to a whole brain position. So when I think about brainwise communication, it's about understanding that this can occur, noticing when it has occurred, and having strategies to come back down to here before we start doing any communicating. So I think one of my overarching sort of perspectives when it comes to training is I'll see lots of training where it'll give you a tool like the Pomodoro method or the 5-3-2 method or whatever it is. And they'll just give you this tool pre-formed and say, off you go and use it, which is great if you're the sort of person who can grasp that and run with it. I'm interested in teaching you how the tool works. And then you can build your own tool, if you like. If you understand the central premise of how this strategy works, you can do whatever you want with it afterwards. And that's far more useful because if you suddenly forget how to do X method, you've lost that tool. It's no longer accessible. But if you understand why it works in the first place, you can build any number of tools that will fit in different spaces. So first thing is to teach you how and why a concept works, right? And then provide some examples of tools you might use. And then we'll act them out. We'll play them out often in the session. We'll do it with each other. We'll do it as a group to see it in practice. And something I quite like as well is make this commitment towards the end of training. So what I used to do when I'm in the room, so when we're not online, you can do it online with some adaptations, but when you're in the room, quite a fun exercise is get everybody to grab a post-it and they write down their email address on that post-it. And they write down one thing they're going to do differently, right? Whatever it is, based on the content of the training today, what they're going to do over this next week They jot that down. And they all stand up and they hand that post-it to somebody else in the room. And now they're accountable to each other to do this thing. You stick a note in a diary for in a week's time, I'm going to email so-and-so and say, hey, did you do that thing? If not, what got in the way? What could we do differently? If you did do it, great. What are you going to do this week? This idea to create systemic accountability. Right? We're here together. So we'll either act them out and do them, we'll understand how they work, and make a commitment to each other to put them into practice. So find lots of ways to make it easy to embed it rather than just saying, go on, do this, and then end of the session.